just as a warning, I understand that the Bible isn't going to show up on the screen, so you're going to have to get your own Bibles out. Okay? And just so you have the warning, we're going to go to Job chapter 38. This book is like a lament, like lament psalms. And I think it serves to keep us honest with God and honest with ourselves. As I was reading and preparing for today, I was kind of hit with this question. Lord, what's my place? And, well, if I were to title the sermon, that would be the title. What's my place? When it comes to the word of the Lord, we sometimes think that some biblical books could be taken in isolation, separate from the rest of the Bible, but every book can be used to support and prove that God guarantees grace and righteousness to those who love and obey Him, and punishment to the wicked. The Bible isn't a random collection of religious sayings or maxims. It isn't, but rather the Bible is a story with a beginning, a center, and a trajectory. And admittedly, some texts are a little hard to understand to me, like Job. In Job, we've got somebody who's got everything. He's rich. He's got a perfect family. Everything is great. He's living the dream. And all of a sudden, bang, everything's gone. Why would God allow this? What's He teaching us? Well, let's read Job. Job 38, verses 1 to 18. The Lord challenges Job. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone? As the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb, and as I clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness? For I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, this far and no further will you come. Here your proud waves must stop. Have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Have you made daylight spread to the ends of the earth to bring an end to the night's wickedness? As the light approaches, the earth takes shape like clay pressed beneath a seal. It is robed in brilliant colors. The light disturbs the wicked and stops the arm that is raised in violence. Have you explored the springs from which the seas come? Have you explored their depths? Do you know where the gates of death are located? Have you seen the gates of utter gloom? Do you realize the extent of the earth? Tell me about it if you know. Word of the Lord. Most of us know that Job was a good man. We've heard that God boasts about him in a conversation with Satan. Satan is then given permission to test how faithful Job would be if he had to endure loss, grief, and pain. And then Job's friends come along. They want to comfort him, but they fail miserably. After a long series of dialogues between Job and his four friends, Job began to live what it is to be molded and refined by God. He's not sure of what's going on, but Job speaks with wisdom. He speaks of his former blessings. He speaks of his anguish. He even protests of innocence and then complaints up here. But doesn't Job, with its massive compilation of complaints about the injustice of it all, finally get fixed when we come to our text in chapter 38? That is, we get to God's answer. God doesn't send any of his angels from heaven to do the job. No, God came directly to Job, and then God asks Job a series of questions which no human could possibly answer. In chapters 38 to 41, except for a couple of verses, consist of God talking to Job, asking him questions. Job responds by recognizing that God's ways are best. During difficult times, we must humbly remember our position before the eternal, holy, and sometimes not understandable God, right? Let me summarize just a little bit about Job. Job chapter 1, verse 1. Once upon a time, in the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. Job was a wealthy man, blameless and upright, who loves and feared God and shunned evil. He had a perfect family of 7 sons and 3 daughters. Now, if you know Old Testament numbers, then you know that number arrives at a perfect number. He owned a perfect ranch, plenty of livestock. He was the greatest man among all the people. And now verse 5b. Sometimes after several days, Job would purify his children. He would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. For Job said to himself, "Perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular practice. And then we continue on in verse 13. Some tests arrive. One day a messenger arrived at Job's home with this news: "Your oxen were plowing, with the donkeys feeding beside them, when the Sabaeans raided us. They stole all the animals and killed all the farmhands." And soon another messenger: "The fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up your sheep and all the shepherds." A third messenger: "3 bands of Chaldean raiders have stolen your camels and killed your servants." Another messenger arrived: "Your sons and daughters were feasting. Suddenly a powerful wind swept and hit the house, and all your children are dead." Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. The next test talks about how Job was stuck with terrible boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. The destruction devastated Job's wife so much that she encouraged him to curse God and die. But instead, Job argues with God and lives. We can infer a lot about Job, but we can't measure his patience, and we know that he was argumentative. Like a lot of chapters of argument. Job and God got into intense arguments. Nevertheless, this ancient story, which is one of the oldest pieces of the Old Testament, stands as an eternal witness that suffering happens. Job kept his faith in God. Can you fight with your best friend and still keep loving him or her? Sometimes when you argue, it's profound and it's public. And sometimes it's personal and private. The saying, "Never morning wears to evening, but some heart breaks." The heart just as sensitive as yours and mine. Could you keep your faith in God even if you actually saw 9/11 happen? When your relative has a tumor and it's malignant, when your loving child is not agreeing with you and is left home, when you walk through a New World Vision project and you see children there still with bloated stomachs from hunger. I'll tell you the truth, my father could not keep his faith. After spending 3 years in a Russian concentration camp, he was one of the ones that survived because he ate his belt and his boots. Which is, by the way, why I never heard about God until I was 13 years old when I left home. Can you keep faith? Listen to this story. One day, parents of a college freshman received this letter from their daughter. It was near the end of her first semester, and here's what it said. Dear Mom and Dad, sorry I failed to write all semester, but college life has kept me really busy. About 2 months ago, I was slightly injured in a car accident near the shopping mall. The injuries were not too serious, and the paramedic was really nice. We went out a few times, and he invited me to move in with him, which sure beats dorm life a lot. He's extremely smart, even though he dropped out of high school. I really like his long hair and tattoos. The weekends are a real blast when we're high on drugs. I especially hope that you like him, since I may be expecting our first child soon. Love, your daughter. P.S. There was no accident, no paramedic, no love affair, no drugs, no baby. However, I am anticipating getting 2 Ds and 1 F this semester. When my grades arrive, I wanted you to keep things in proper perspective. And today's sermon really is about perspective, how we understand God's perspective and how we understand our own perspective. God's perspective is not the same as our fleshly, resentful perspective. If we keep ourselves in daily intimacy with God, then any test we have, we really have to go through, will keep us keeping faith in God. To finish that story, he had a stroke about a year before he passed away. His right side was totally paralyzed. It went through his vocal cords. He couldn't talk. He was right-handed, so he couldn't write. And either myself or Odorai or some of our friends would read the Bible to him every day. He didn't have a choice. The night before he passed away, he did this. So I'm hoping and praying that he actually said yes to the Lord. But he went through most of his life just absolutely rejecting God because of suffering he went through. His perspective was, he didn't want to believe in a God that allowed this to happen. Never mind that it was us who made it happen. Anyways, Satan had this conversation with God where he said this, I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. And I kind of took a step back when I heard the word patrolling. You know, that's scary. He's patrolling. He's looking for where he can find our weak spots. I'm sure we've got weak spots. And the only way really to strengthen them is to stick to the Lord. But that whole thing is another sermon. Anyways, in verse 8, then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of a complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look at how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to his face, to your face. And isn't that the world's perspective? When we lack money or material things, don't we curse God and turn away from him? sure hope we don't. Isn't life a matter of maintaining proper perspective? So what things can cause us to lose God's perspective in our lives, and why? Here's several things to think about. Suffering. Does suffering turn us from God? Confusion. Does confusion turn us from God? We are created. And then, oh no, what if we're not the center of the universe? And number 4, we have a creator. You know, the first one, the suffering, is the problem of human suffering and God's involvement in the pain of the world is always with us. Efforts to find the cause of suffering often lead us, as Job and his counselors, to put the blame somewhere. On self, on others, God, or Satan. The book of Job asks us to look beyond blame, accept ambiguity and uncertainty, and trust God for what we cannot see or control. The second, confusion. Eugene Peterson once said, "Sufferers attract fixers the way roadkill attracts vultures." Everybody wants to say something that will make everything all right. Job had some friends who showed up to console him. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were their names. When they heard of Job's trouble, they decided they would come and extend their sympathy and comfort him. They did one thing right. The 2nd chapter of Job tells us that they came, and for 7 days and 7 nights they sat with him and didn't say a word. They were just present. If you want to know how to really be helpful to people in their moments of trouble, just sit with them in their sorrow. It's called ministry of presence. So very often when someone is hurting, they don't want you to pat them on the back and say, "Oh, it'll be fine." They don't want your instant fix-it solutions or your 20/20 hindsight. They just need somebody to be there and sit with them so they're not alone. So somebody's present with them. Job's friends were known for their wisdom. But in the end, their wisdom was narrow-minded and incomplete. It was when they started talking that they got into big trouble. When these 3 friends decided that they would make sense out of the senseless, explain the unexplainable, defend God who seemed so feeble, they really got into trouble. They tried to help by giving explanations about the events of the life that are too awesome for any of us to understand or comprehend. Eliphaz said, "Job, you know things like this just happen. Every vine needs to be pruned every now and then and cut back. You will be better because of this pain you're going through. Learn from it and go on." It sounds like good advice, but it's doubtful that it came from God, because later on God criticized Eliphaz for misrepresenting him. Bildad said to Job, "How long will you go on like this?" He wrongly assumed that people suffer only as a result of their sins. "What else did you expect?" he said. "These kids of yours have been partying every weekend. In fact, when the tornado hit, they were in a big elaborate party. No wonder they got wiped out. God's not going to tolerate that kind of thing in life." He was less sensitive and compassionate, saying that Job's children died because of their wickedness. Zophar said, "Job, everything has a reason, and because everything has a reason, there is a time for every purpose under heaven. Don't ever be asking God why this happens. Just accept it, take it. It's a way of life." Job was a righteous man. Even during his time of testing, he was able to see the confusion in his friends' advice. To every one of these explanations his friends offered, Job responded. The problem was, they and we, when we run into similar cases, lose perspective. Sometimes it's because we want to give simple answers to the pain of life. We sometimes think we are a person of integrity and wisdom, at least in our own minds, And we talk, not asking God in prayer beforehand to guide us in our tongues and our hearts. So what do you do when perspective is lost? How do we regain it? Well, I'm not sure I have an answer for you. And that is not necessarily what the book of Job is about. There are a couple of things that go on in this book that I think we could apply to our own lives, though. Job and his friends want to focus their attention on the meaning of individual suffering. But God invites Job to see himself and his anxieties within the matrix of a wonderfully made world. In other words, Job is not really a book about divine pastoral care. It's about divine perspective and human wonder. The third point was we are created. Two things happen in the story of Job. First is that Job is shocked into the reality that he is the created and not the creator, not the center of the universe. Second, we are made in the image of God. We are not God. It is a happy day when we discover that truth. Neither Job nor we will find God's creation or in God's words an answer to human suffering. Rather, as Reverend Dan Simonson, a professor of Old Testament studies, says, and I quote, Job is advised to recognize human limits and trust that God will take care of what Job and others cannot know or do. God has a place for each one of us, as he has a place for each creature on earth. Talking about places, I was thinking as I was coming here today, my place should be at home in bed when I see the weather out there. But then he said, no, your place is here. Fourth, we have a creator. You and I are God's creation. We're not God's, and the quicker we discover it, the better we'll understand life. I may have a point of view, you may have a point of view, but God has an overview. Let God be God. How do you gain perspective in the midst of life? You remember not only that you are created, you remember that you have a creator. God is watching us. God is watching us not from a distance, but God is working for and with us in the thick and thin of our existence, yes? Satan might be controlling, but God is here. We can quarrel with God. We can fight with God. We can make up with God. And whatever we do, we are never without God. God can handle your arguments. God can live with us through our despair. God can deal with our arrogance. But stay in there with God until you know the communion between Creator and the created in your life. Yes? We might curse God for the circumstances, or we might invite God into the circumstances, into our lives. When God answers Job, God's answer breaks open Job's world and expands his vision to include places and creatures Job never imagined in his former life. God speaks of freedom and grace rather than reward and retribution. God gives his creatures the freedom to be who they were created to be. Wild and beautiful. God also maintains order by placing limits on forces that would plunge the world into chaos. Talking about the sea, Leviathan, even human wickedness. The world is not centered on human beings according to God's words. It is not entirely safe or a predictable world, but it is beautiful and good nonetheless. And God invites Job, he invites us to live in that wild and beautiful world. God shaped you and me, and he invites us to use stewardship of the mind, heart, and soul, and see with God's perspective of grace and justice before we jump to wrong conclusions. God invites us daily to have patience and faith, to have endurance and integrity. There's one more thing to note about God's words. For all God's silence concerning human beings, God gives humanity and Job a singular place in creation. Job is the only passenger on this grand tour of the cosmos. And through it, God invites him and us to see the world from a God's eye point of view and to delight in its beauty and freedom just as God does. Is this an adequate response to Job's suffering? Probably not, but it is very comforting. There is real pain and we want a real purpose. For Job, this comes when God at last shows up. But now I have seen you with my own eyes in 42:5, offering the comfort that only God can give. With all that, these words of God at the end of the book of Job accomplish something profound. They move Job out of his endless cycle of grief into life again. They enable him to live freely in a world full of heartbreaking suffering and heart-stopping beauty, and to do so in a way that reflects God's own care and love for his children and for the world. That's us. No matter what hits us, God is with us. He created this beautiful, wonderful world, and it's up to us to love, to share, to do our best to be like Jesus, and above all, when trouble hits, to keep our faith, yes? So let's keep our faith. Let's keep the Lord at the center. Amen? Pray with me. Father God, we ask you to surround us with your robe of protection. Put it around our lives, our children, our neighbors, our community here at MCF. From Job, we learn to judge our lives differently. So God, awaken in us that hunger and thirst for you, which will lead us to your will and your peace. Help us, Lord. Open our eyes to see your unexpected blessings. Open our hearts to welcome you when you come to us in strange ways with your living presence. And Lord, with what's happening in the world now with the coronavirus, Lord, we ask you for your hedge of protection around each one. We ask you for your protection, Lord. And Lord, when evil is prowling, Satan is patrolling, you, Lord, are here. And so I ask, Lord, what's my place in your plan? When we differ, Lord, in opinions and points of view, Lord, just let us see your view. We honor and praise you in Jesus' name.